Hi, I'm Sam Candy. Welcome to Sustain Talks. Today, I'm joined by Ben Kellard, Director of Business Strategy at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Hi, Ben. How are you?
Hi, Sam. Really good. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Good to have you here. We've had some great conversations before, so I'm really looking forward to today. Tell us a bit more about your experience in sustainability and, of course, about CISL.
Thanks. Yeah, so we're quite an unusual institute, part of Cambridge University. We've been around over 30 years now, probably best known for educating leaders on sustainable business right across the world. But we also have a whole centres looking at the role of sustainable finance. We also have a whole team looking at the engagement policy. So what's the regulatory environment needed to create a low carbon sustainable future? And the centre I sit within is around business transformation. So we do both sort of research, advisory work, looking at what is a sustainable purpose-led business, and then how do businesses understand where they're starting from and how and why they can transform to that future. And that's all underpinned by our full-time academics and our executive education work.
Yeah, so I'd like to go into that a little bit more deeply, leading with a sustainable purpose. I've heard that term so many times. What does that mean, really?
It's a good question, because I think there's been a lot talked about in terms of the rise of corporate purpose, and then also about sustainability, but often the two don't necessarily connect up. So there's open to a lot of ambiguity. And some of the work we've been doing is really about unpacking what do we mean by bringing those concepts together. So both through external networks we're part of and plus our own research. And I think so we convened sort of 4 leading businesses who are probably furthest ahead on this. So it's the people you'd expect, like Ikea, Unilever, the big Dutch chemicals business DSM, and Interface Floor, the US carpet tile manufacturer, because they're like 10 plus years down the track on this. And what they've done is they've really integrated sustainability and evidence-based goals into their core purpose and strategy. And what we found is they did a sort of number of things to do that. First of all, they took crucially an outside-in view. So they started with, how is the world changing around us? Because all the evidence is telling us we're going through fundamental changes, you know, whether that's the impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, inequality, and so on. So they really engaged with stakeholders, did research, say, how is that reshaping our markets? How is that reshaping our categories? And what are different stakeholders really expecting from us? You know, everything from not just the consumer, but how governments and investors are expecting. So they did that kind of really tracking, understanding how the world's changing. Then they took an inside out view, which asked themselves, what are we really good at? And one of the things that strikes me is how few businesses have actually really good, sharp answer to that question. So not the marketing spin, but what do our people think we're really good at? And then what they did is they then brought those two perspectives together to say, how do we use our core capabilities as a business and do that to serve society in a way which is consistent with those trends? So it means that we're really relevant moving into the future, and we're actually tapping into growing needs in society. And so where there are, you know, potential or current new value propositions, where there are ways of driving innovation and transforming sort of businesses, what it does in order to, you know, and achieve that. And there's examples of, you know, businesses who have done that, like Umicore, for example, who were a sort of a metallurgy business, and they start off in the 90s with sort of high smelting, sort of, you know, very polluting businesses. And what they did is they pivoted around materials for good. And what they did is they basically invested massively into R&D, like tenfold over 10 years. They used a new purpose to sort of drive and repivot that business. And they started to sell off some of their smelting businesses that were unprofitable and high carbon. And they've actually pivoted the whole business now into clean tech. They're actually even leading urban mining to get, you know, rare earth elements and so on. And they're really at the forefront of the sort of, you know, low carbon clean economy, but all pivoting around their core capabilities around science and metallurgy. And that's an example of how they've really understood how the world's changing around them. And so I think that's the characteristic of what leading businesses are doing. And in the process, they're sort of both unlocking whole new markets, whole new value propositions, They're, aligning with stakeholder expectations of them. They're engaging employees who can feel really proud and excited about what the business is doing. And so there's all these sort of multiple, I think, benefits that they're gleaning from going through that process.
Yeah, that's a complete transformation of business, right? And I know you recently wrote a report about transforming business. Tell us, because that is a massive pivot to, you're starting with one thing and you're changing into another because you're leading with a sustainable purpose, right?
It is. And I think the other thing, Sam, is it's different from how business and sometimes conventional businesses who, let's be honest, one of the reasons we're in the situation we are is because businesses have just reported on creating financial value. And where they've either created or destroyed value for society or nature has been invisible. And so what that's meant is that businesses aren't really reflecting the true costs of doing business. And also it acts as an incentive. If they can, if you like, create negative value for society and nature and liquidate that for profits, that's exactly what our economy is designed businesses to do, and that's exactly what they're doing. And whether that's creating, say, addictive food products or gambling habits that are creating negative impacts on society. So what this isn't is about just saying, how do we just sort of incrementally change our business model to try and take risk out of it? So if we're using carbon, how do we reduce that just enough to keep under the radar, to keep our current business model trucking along? And that's not what was being proposed here, because while that's alluring, the reality is you're just limping on a business model to try and get maybe another decade out of it if you're lucky, rather than saying, how do we need to fundamentally pivot this business to not only be relevant and resilient in the future, but actually really unlock value in the new economy, rather than trying to just squeeze out as much as we can in the old high waste, high carbon economy that's contributing to inequality. It's really about that pivot. So yeah, the report we wrote about leading with a sustainable purpose really practically sets out these sort of, there's over 50 practical things that these businesses did, clustered around sort of three main buckets of the journey. So one is, how do they sort of develop and align their purpose and strategy with a sustainable future? Secondly, how do they internally integrate that within the business? And that third key one around, how do they engage externally? How do they report? How do they communicate? How do they set up strategic partnerships? How do they, advocate and shift government policy and so on? What's the role in all of that? So it really kind of sets that in a practical way. And I think that's hopefully really helpful for businesses who are trying to figure out, how all this stuff hangs together.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but a lot of people are skeptical. I just want to go a little bit deeper, especially because, you have a lot of experience in this area. So, what are your thoughts on climate change? Do you think we're too late? Do you think we have a chance? What's your real feelings about where we are today and what we need to do?
Well, I think the sobering thing, although COP26 was great, a lot came out of it, and there's a real renewed sense of ambition. And while I wasn't there, I know a lot of sort of my peers were, and they reflected a real renewed sense of energy, and particularly business representation. CEOs of large corporations not talking off scripts, but where they didn't really understand the part of the business, but really about the central part of the business, which is all encouraging. Reality is the science that was underpinning that conference was 10 years out of date. That's how long it takes for the IPCC to do its peer reviews and turn that into policy recommendations. So we're expecting more the updates to come this year. So I think the reality is we are breaking extremely late. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of very eminent scientists saying we've already passed the point of no return now. So we're really right on the cusp of runaway climate change, really. And the reality is that the impacts that are already in the system and in the atmosphere are still going to take years to work their way through. So it's not the direct cause and effect. So we are going to have to live with the profound impacts of climate change. I think that the idea of a smooth transition to a low carbon future, I think that horse is bolted. This is a personal point of view. So I think we're into a bumpy ride. I think we're into a disruptive future, because we're going to be disrupted either by the continued impacts of climate change by us not taking it seriously. And secondly, I think that we're going to have huge disruption by decarbonising at the rate we need to decarbonise. And so for either way, we're going to be hitting major disruption moving forward.
Yeah. Did you see the movie Don't Look Up?
No, I didn't. No.
We'll talk about it later. But I mean, obviously that's really scary to hear that, just that currently we have a lot of issues with climate change, with floods, with drought. I think if people were going to make differences now, what kind of things should they be focusing on? Obviously leading with a sustainable purpose and transforming your business, but is it reducing energy? What are those things that a business should be doing immediately?
Well, I think it is fair to say that most businesses, even leaders that I'm talking to, are not wrapping their heads around just the scale of change that we're facing, because it's pretty much exponential on a number of fronts, and very few businesses have really wrapped their heads around what that means for them and their value chain. So that's my experience. And I think that's why this outside-in approach is so important. And so I'd say that I think for businesses, the reality is most need to go on a journey. And so I think the first thing is that a lot of businesses struggle to really understand where are their material carbon impacts. That's a major kind of challenge they face when there's not good data in the system. And particularly, so the whole idea of scope 3, so be going on your direct, beyond your direct impacts, how are our sourcing impacts, carbon impacts, and downstream, how are our products used and disposed of? There's very little kind of reliable data. And it gets worse because often as you look up the value chain and you go up the sort of supply chain, usually the risks increase and the quality of data drops. So I think the first thing is getting a good enough handle as a business on where your big impacts and risks are. That's, I think, the kind of the first thing. Rather than thinking you have to, have life cycle analysis for everything, but it could be, for example, using proxy data that's out there, or are you sourcing from areas that have poor human rights issues, for example, just getting a sort of good enough, or so I think that's the kind of the first thing, and seeing, okay, well, what are the sort of the things that we can do which are within our direct control? So that might be looking at starting with the the energy hierarchy. So how can we actually take out use of sort of energy in the first place? How do we become more efficient? That's always a smart place to start. Then moving on to things like how do we switch out into cleaner sources of energy, and so on. So within your direct control, but also thinking, how do we then start to work with key partners? And that's usually either customers and key suppliers, to start to really shift, the business model and to find even greater efficiencies. So, and working with customers is exciting, because it's like, how are you trying to decarbonize? What are some of the products and services you're looking at? How can we help you to enable, that shift? So there's opportunities for kind of co-innovation with customers that can help them and you unlock new market opportunities, and similarly driving innovation with tier 1 and 2 suppliers in order to deliver those. But I think as part of that, need to really think about that kind of wider picture, and what are those kind of services and market segments we want to be tapping into in the medium to long term. So not just limping along our current products and services, but what are those new, so for example, if you're in transportation, that's going to be completely disrupted with driverless cars, probably moving to sharing economy, integrated multimodal transportation, so on. So, if you're anything to do with, for example, transportation, the idea that you own a gas guzzling car out the front almost certainly isn't going to be the reality in, say, even 5 or 10 years time. So, what's your role in that transformation? That's just mobility, and we can of course reflect that in pretty much every other segment of what that transformation might look like.
And in this transformation, what do you think the biggest challenges are to that?
Well, what I guess I'm seeing is sort of a number. First of all, there's often, I think, a sort of cycle of misinformation, where usually you have there's in almost all sectors I'm looking at, you're getting data from consumers and sort of customers saying, we want to be making more sustainable choices, but we don't know how, and we don't know how to deliver them. But we will use them if they're at the similar price and quality as sort of, what I'm used to. But then you have the sort of if you like, whoever the service buyer is, not knowing how to translate that into their suppliers, and the suppliers not knowing how to provide it to customers because they don't know what the sustainable solutions are. So you get this kind of ignorance. We don't really know what metrics we're looking at. Is it carbon, waste? What is it? And how do we create those new products and services? That's one, but that's both an opportunity as well as a barrier. So I think bringing sort of multiple stakeholders together, and like, for example, mobility, it might mean bringing in both users of those services, but also things like municipalities who are actually, governing transportation within, say, a city, actual transportation providers and so on, car manufacturers. So it's maybe about convening those stakeholders to unlock those opportunities. Then you move into kind of two other, I think, common barriers, which is then how do you align other people in the value chain? So how do you work with suppliers to provide those solutions? And then there's the third one is almost always there's a kind of wider infrastructural regulatory barriers that need aligning. So how do those who say consortiums or initiatives start to either get behind initiatives that are trying to drive the right regulation? So for example, staying with mobility, are there legal barriers to having integrated transportation? Do we need that in terms of allowing, to allow transparency of, different, modes of transport, or do we need infrastructure like smart technology in order to have driverless cars and so on? So there's that kind of third bit around how do you, get the other kind of the infrastructure and policy around to unlock those new, products and services.
So much collaboration, isn't it? You really have to bring, and it's what I'm hearing all the time about, not just turning those suppliers away, but actually helping them and working with them to all go on the journey together.
Exactly. Sam, just on that point, I agreed. And I think one of the things that we sort of found through the report is the risk is that businesses get confused by that. It's like, do I collaborate with everybody? I'm not used to I'm used to just delivering value within my link in the value chain, Whereas what we found with leaders, when you take that outside in, inside out view, and you're clear about, what parts of the population we're serving, what segments, where our capability is and where our capability runs out within our sphere of control and influence, it puts into much sharper relief what you need from what strategic partners and where the gaps are. So it leads to a kind of a laser focus, if you like, on who need to collaborate with and why. And that then is a much more focused strategic way of collaborating rather than, let's play with everybody who might be vaguely interested in what we are. That lacks focus, and that just drains, time in, let's face it, most businesses, are time poor, right?
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk over the last, I think just before COP and before, for those in the know, about net zero, getting to net zero, going beyond net zero. Can you, with your insight and experience, explain that a little bit more? Because I think businesses are really confused about what that means and how they get there.
They are, and it's led to a lot of confusion. So the Science-Based Target Initiative had launched just before COP, a new framework to help understand what net zero is. So I'd really encourage taking a look at that. But essentially try to put it into kind of basic terms. The idea is that we really look at across the value chain of a business, where are those big material carbon impacts and how are they sort of neutralized as much as possible. So it's about really fundamentally reducing them through innovation, in order to do that. And so that they recognize there will be some residual carbon, which can then either be sort of say offset or by additional carbon reductions in other parts of the value chain will, if you like, counter other bits of residual carbon in other parts of hard to abate in other parts of the value chain. So the idea is that across the value chain is therefore netting out. So while there might be, if you like, across the graph, if that's zero, there might be some residual, bits left over, but then others will come underneath that. And that's where the netting comes out, if you like. So it's not saying we'll remove all carbon right across the value chain, recognize that's not really feasible in most, but it is saying we are making real fundamental, absolute reductions. That's what it is about. And that can only be done back to our collaboration point about understanding where those big impacts are and who businesses need to work with in order to tackle that. Because no business is going to be able to do it on its own. It'll have to collaborate with, unlock sources of, finance. It'll have to create the right regulatory environment. It'll have to rely on other sectors, like going back to mobility. We're only going to decarbonize mobility if the energy sector moves to renewable energy. Otherwise, it's driven by coal powered electricity, which is like worse than cars as they are today. So I think that's the kind of the nub of it, which is why it comes back to that point. where are the big impacts, and what do we need to do within our control and sphere of influence in order to really materially reduce those.
Okay. Another thing that we hear a lot about is nature-based solutions.
Right.
Can you explain a bit more about that and what that means?
Yeah, so what we mean by kind of nature-based solutions is because sometimes it's easy to think about kind of, you know, climate change over here, nature over here, society over here, as if they're sort of, you know, separated. And of course, we know they're not. They're fundamentally connected, you know. So, you know, why are we, you know, have often the reason why we're sort of driving in lots of parts of the world things like deforestation, high carbon solutions, is because there aren't other jobs in those regions for people to do. That's a social issue driving it, you know. And similarly, there are a lot of nature-based solutions that reduce carbon emissions. And so the idea is saying, basically, how can we take sort of both inspiration from nature to, you know, reduce carbon? Now, there's a lot, for example, in agriculture, where if we take, for example, improving soil health. So if we're adding in things like biochar, which is sort of way of, you know, locked in carbon into soils, it's both locking carbon from the biochar into the soils, improving soil health, which is improving then the, you know, the produce being grown from those fields. And so you're getting, that's an example of a nature-based solution. But also by, for example, having, you know, trees planted within it, and you're also reducing flood risk. You might be able to have, you know, graze cattle underneath those trees or crops and so on. So these are, or livestock. So these are ways of finding, if you like, nature-based solutions, or even in things like, you know, new product manufacturing. Are there ways of using natural materials that, again, have come from, you know, sort of sustainable feedstocks that replace fossil fuel alternatives? And so that's what we're really looking for, is ways of, if you like, both reducing carbon through using, say, feedstocks that have come from ways of, you know, nurturing nature and supporting nature rather than, you know, taking its resources. That's also linked to the circular economy, because of course, if we're keeping resources within the economy, we're not pulling in, you know, virgin raw materials into those sort of product and service systems. Yeah, so that's in a summary, it's ways of sort of trying to kill several birds with one stone, if you like, and taking inspiration from nature in order to do that.
Yeah. Getting to net zero and nature-based solutions, there's a lot of companies that have done that through offsetting. What are, but you know, I think offset as a final solution obviously does need to be done in some circumstances. But what are your thoughts on offsetting?
Yeah, I think where offsetting is a problem is when it's where people start from. So we talked about the kind of carbon hierarchy. If you start with sort of, you know, eliminating, reducing, switching, and then you move, the last thing is sort of for residual, hard to remove, is sort of is offsetting. So the issue is when businesses think, great, we'll get the checkbook out, we'll just offset, you know. That's why that's not net zero, because that's not making material reductions in those big impacts across the value chain. So that's where it's a problem, because otherwise we're sort of just horse trading on, if, you know, then it becomes a market for, well, it's good that it drives up demand for, you know, carbon solutions, but it's not really going to get us the material cuts we need. So I think it has a place potentially as a transitional technology, but really the focus needs to be on, as I say, how are we converting our value chains to deliver, you know, net zero solutions? What's the innovation required? How do we need to unlock the funding which, you know, fuels the innovation? That's where the focus needs to be, rather than how do we, you know, carry on with our current business models as best we can by offsetting activities happening over there. That's the kind of the if you like, the strategic and conceptual shift that we need to be making. And even when we do come to offsetting, you know, again, you can be really strategic about it, making sure you find really high quality you know, programs, but also things like insetting. So that idea that rather than sort of offsetting, say, planting trees in Uganda, what can we do within our value chain to unlock investments within our value chain? So it might be, for example, use that investment as seed funding for, say, new innovative agricultural practices in your supply chain, or setting up a ethical intermediary, or which wouldn't have got off the ground otherwise, but can have a material impact within your value chain. So even when you do get to that point, there are creative ways of doing that, again, which is about scaling real impact.
Yeah, I see a lot of construction companies doing that, you know, where they're maybe disrupting a city or an area, that they then invest some of that money into the community. And I think that really works well, doesn't it?
It does. And I think particularly where it's in the service of creating those sort of breakthrough innovations that are needed. So I think it's less helpful if it's sort of almost an offsetting where, you know, we're going to put in this development which isn't delivering a lot of social value, and then we'll go and pay for a sort of, you know, a community centre over there which got nothing to do with us. That I think is unhelpful, because that's back into the kind of CSR mentality where we keep the current business model trucking along, making profits from an unsustainable business model, and we offset that, if you like, by doing side of play peripheral activities over here. So I think if it's about how we're investing in communities which are using our core competence, you know, is serving parts of the community that we're there to deliver, either through, say, because we're going to be recruiting them in, you know, to our business, we're going to be serving them through our, say, whatever the buildings are, you know, retail parks, accommodation, and so on. So it's in a much more holistic way of saying, how we, you know, adding value to this part of society that we're serving. And I think what's exciting in that is it opens up all sorts of creative options. So we're seeing, for example, supermarkets starting to really think about, how do we add value to our local communities, really understand their needs. So rather than just coming in with a generic solution, what are the needs they have? How do we as a supermarket can serve those? Can we, you know, buy from more local, you know, sources, which, you know, tackles, you know, unemployment or brings in apprentices and so on. And similarly for developers, you know, what are the needs of the society, rather than just dropping in a sort of a residential, you know, and just cashing in. How do, you know, what are the nuances around those needs? Are there opportunities for collaboration with interesting local groups or schools or colleges or NGOs or what have you? It becomes, again, generating value for the development and for society. And that, I think, becomes really quite exciting.
Yeah. Last year was, I think, an interesting year for most of us. Second year of the pandemic. But were there any important lessons that you learned?
Yeah, I think, like a lot of us, that sort of period of isolation and reflection led to some pretty deep reflections, really, about what's important to me, what's important to, you know, my work, and what sort of society do we want moving forward. And I'm lucky in that I get to think about a lot of that kind of stuff a lot of the time. But when it's really driven home at such a personal level, when we're stripped bare, you know, I think it leads to some profound thinking. And I've certainly noticed that with a lot of people that I've spoken to, and of course many have, you know, seriously suffered under the pandemic. So I think what it's, I guess, partly reinforced for me is what's really important. And often it's the kind of the old adage that the best things in life are free. And I think for me, what does that mean kind of professionally, is that I think it's about this sort of shift from the old economy, which is really about acquisition. You know, it's about, we are what we consume increasingly, you know, as Mark Carney said, you know, we've, in lectures, which I'd really recommend, we've gone from a kind of market economy to a market society. And as Oscar Wilde said, you know, the risk of that is we you know, the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think it's very much the old economy we're used to. And it's still let's be honest, you know, the main consumer economy we're in today, where it's all about we are what we own. But that's then finite. And it means that, you know, if I own a car, you can't own it as well. You know, it's binary. Whereas I think shifting that to this, if you like, I think the well-being economy that's often being used, where it's about people flourishing, and that's monetizable. How do businesses enable human flourishing and well-being, not just through better health, but really, you know, through leading to strong relationships, strong communities, allowing people to create and flourish in that way. That's really exciting, because that's an abundant economy. That's not based on owning stuff. Like, there's stuff has to play in that, but it can be shared. And then your flourishing inspires my flourishing. And therefore it's abundant. It's not binary like the old economy. So I think that's the game to be played for. That's the kind of the big opportunity, but it's a fundamental shift in how businesses think, where it's about, how do we flog stuff? You know, that underpins pretty much, you know, the old economy. And so how do we sort of enable people to flourish, you know, and how do we monetize that? That's a game changer. And I think for me, that's what I think people are really longing for. It's certainly what we need from environmental perspectives. So yeah, I think that's the kind of the exciting reflection I had about hopefully what Build Back Better might look like.
Yeah, I totally agree, and had very much the same reflections myself. What about, yeah, I've come into this year I've set so many goals. I'm really feeling positive about 2022. What about for yourself? Have you set any goals personally or professionally?
Yeah, well, it's really exciting to be part of the work we're doing, because I think first of all, it's about creating the sort of the thought leadership to help businesses find their role in this new economy, and we're investing a lot of work in that. We've just launched a paper called Unleashing Sustainable Business, which sets out the kind of foundation for a sustainable business. We've got more white papers coming out unpacking that. We're also working with external collaboration. So we've got the new BSI principle-based standard coming out in the spring, which is working with peers of ours around what is a sustainable purpose-led business, to really have a kind of single, clear, common view on what that looks like. That's coming out, you know. So I think helping to sort of shape the role of business in this sort of, if you like, flourishing well-being economy is really exciting, and to be a part of that, and really inspiring. And I think working with both other practitioners who are working in this space, so it's not just a CISL view, but we're contributing to other, you know, and business leaders, working with business leaders to really kind of get their insights and test the ideas with them. So I'm really excited about being involved in all of that, to hopefully help us sort of, you know, enable this sort of transformation and pivot that's desperately required for both individual businesses if they want a long-term future, and for, you know, society. So yeah, I am excited about the year ahead, but also very realistic about the kind of the headwinds and challenges and uncertainties that we face at the same time.
Yeah, we are excited about being a partner with CISL for our conference, the Responsible Futures Conference, and having you speak, which people can find out more information on our website, responsible-futures.com, sorry, responsiblefuturesconference.com. But for now, I just want to say thank you. I could listen to you all day. I say that often, but I really could. I learn so much from you every time we have a conversation. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Emma. I always enjoy our chats, and really looking forward to the conference. I think it's going to be a really interesting sort of time to come together, reflect and inspire one another. So yeah, really looking forward to that as well.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Thanks. You too. Bye now.
Bye.